Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We are continuing our discussion of slavery in the colonial era. And in this lecture, we're going to move on to a discussion of the process by which African slaves were transported from their homeland of Africa across the Atlantic to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage. Just as a forewarning, some of the examples and passages I'll use in these descriptions can be graphic and disturbing. It's not my intention to be gratuitous, but I think a description of slavery that doesn't include at least some of these kinds of descriptions is simply inaccurate. So be forewarned. The Middle Passage sometimes is used to refer simply to the period of time when slaves were on the ships being transported from Africa to the Americas. I'm going to broaden that interpretation somewhat and incorporate the time when they were in their homeland and a bit of the time after they arrive in the Americas. But understand the image you see here is one depiction of what that process looked like. We're going to be talking extensively about some other descriptions of that Middle Passage. So understand the process begins in Africa, and oftentimes far in the interior of Africa. It's a mistake to think that all African slaves came from the coast. As this horrific institution evolved and grew and became very profitable, a number of groups along the coast would actually embark deep into the interior of Africa and capture other Africans to sell to the Europeans as slaves because it was such a profitable practice. So in many cases, the story begins hundreds of miles inland. Oftentimes, those who were to be enslaved would be ripped away from their family and their homes, completely unaware that anything was about to happen to them. And so a lot of what happens in the early part of this process would have been just unbelievably jarring and unsettling. You're ripped away from your home, thrown into chains, and marched off to who knows where. You don't really know what's coming. They would be marched in these human trains that were known as coffles, tied together at the neck, men, women, and children, sometimes for hundreds of miles. And of course, by the time they arrived at the coast, they would already be completely exhausted and depleted from thirst, hunger, exposure, mistreatment, and just the process of the march itself. And upon reaching the coast, they would be thrown into a prison for holding. And of course, conditions even in those prisons was horrific. And so untold thousands would have died at some stage in this process already without ever even making it to the ocean itself. In those prisons where they were being held, they would have met Europeans for the first time. They would be examined head to toe by some version of doctor. Many of them would be rejected on the spot, meaning that they would have to be sold again to other slave traders and often sent to some even more horrible fate. Those that passed the inspection were then put into canoes and ferried out to the slave ships. Now, again, at this point, most of them have never seen the ocean before or the sea. They have no idea what's coming, and many of them threw themselves overboard before even reaching the ship. Conditions on board the slave ships were, of course, horrible beyond description. Food and water were limited and often spoiled when they were given food or water at all. They were kept in chains throughout the process, oftentimes below quarters and oftentimes so close together that they could scarcely move. You see here one of the notorious depictions of the hold of a slave ship with humans packed head to toe, literally through every inch of the quarters. There was, of course, nowhere to go to the bathroom. Quarters would be filled with human excrement and vomit. Illness and disease spread very quickly, and many slaves died at some point in this process. The heat would have been unbelievably oppressive, and the sounds and smells, which we can only imagine and can't be documented in real time, must have been horrible as well. The sounds of people moaning, crying, sniffling, perhaps would have driven one to madness. It's estimated that 10 to 20% of all the slaves on these voyages perished along the way. Dead slaves typically would simply be thrown overboard. And some estimate that only about 50% of all who were captured and enslaved survived that first year from the point of capture, including the journey on the ship and those first several horrible months in the Americas. Half of all of those captured died within a year. Treatment on board the ships could be incredibly cruel. The slaves, of course, would be confused, frightened, angry. They had no idea what was to befall them. Many of them refused to eat and would be treated very severely for that, either forced to eat, whipped horribly, they might be beaten, even hot coals put on their lips to encourage them to eat. In other cases, the whites had developed a device to pry open their mouths and force them to eat. Other times they would try to leap overboard. Oftentimes they would be chained together to prevent them from doing that. And at times even whole groups would jump over together. Many of the ships developed systems of nets and so on at the sides of the ship to prevent them. And of course anyone caught trying to jump overboard would have been treated very severely. Here are the words of John Atkins, an English sailor writing in 1721. The captain whipped or scarified several plotters of rebellion and sentenced others to cruel deaths, making them first eat the heart and liver of one of them killed. The woman he hoisted up by the thumbs, whipped and slashed her with knives before the other slaves till she died. For those who survived the voyage and reached the Americas, they would then be examined again, put on the auction block, and sold. At some point they would be branded, as you see in this picture, to indicate who their owners were. And only then do they begin the dehumanizing, degrading, intense and horrific process of being a slave itself and working for presumably the rest of their lives. The entire process was unbelievably dehumanizing, frightening, and humiliating. It typically took some 6 months from the time they were captured in Africa to the time they arrived at whatever their new home would be in the Americas. We can only imagine how horrible that experience must have been for those who endured it, but without question it would have been among the worst months of their lives. Unbelievable suffering. I want to read you some selections from one of our primary sources related to the Middle Passage and the way that slaves were treated. It's a slave narrative that was written by Olaudah Equiano, who was also known as Gustavus Vasa. Equiano was captured in 1756 at the age of about 11 in Nigeria and underwent the process that I described in the previous few slides. Eventually he was able to work his way to freedom, became anglicized, changed his name to Gustavus Vasa, became educated, and went on to write this famous narrative. And we have many such narratives which give us windows into what the process was like. And full disclosure, there is some doubt as to the veracity of this narrative, although most people believe it is at least a real document and probably an accurate description of what Equiano endured. So here are some passages from Equiano's slave narrative. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were sound by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. He goes on a bit later. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon, to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands, and laid me across, I think, the windlass, and tied my feet, while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, I naturally feared that element the first time I saw it. Yet nevertheless, could I have got over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely, who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I have seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. This indeed was often the case with myself. In the next lecture, we'll continue a discussion of slavery in the colonies after those slaves had survived the Middle Passage.